I think about trauma as essentially being anything that knocks you off that path and forces your brain to create some sort of an adaptive response to move in a new path or to try to get back on that path in some way.
All right, everybody, welcome back to Flip That Shit. I am your host, Stacey Uhrig, and my guest today is Kyira Wackett. And I'm so happy to have Kyira back. If you didn't catch our first episode, you're going to want to catch it. The link is going to be in the show notes. And really what I loved about our first conversation, let me just introduce you. She's a licensed mental health practitioner who specializes in shame. We had an amazing first part conversation about her personal experience as a client who was dealing with her own traumatic history, her own adverse experiences, and then becoming a mental health practitioner and really holding space for people for their own trauma, their own shame. And in that episode, we talked and we kind of dabbled in a little conversation about complex PTSD, talking about the different lenses through which we each saw it, which was really great. So I strongly encourage you to go back and check out that first episode. I wanted to have Kyira come back because I love to jam out about this shit. And she and I had a great convo, and I asked her if she'd be willing to come back so we can dive into a simple yet complex question, which is, what is trauma really? I think this is my biggest passionate piece because I think people are super misinformed about what it is. And so they negate the fact that trauma may be impacting their life in adulthood. If you find yourself still stuck, but you didn't have an act of violence or abuse or acts of aggression laid upon you, and you're automatically disqualifying yourself as someone who had had a traumatic experience or a set of adverse experiences that were resonating in your system as traumatic, you might not be able to get the appropriate support, right? And without the appropriate support, you're going to still feel stuck. And my goal for all of you guys is peace. So welcome back, Kyira.
Oh, I'm so excited. As you're talking, I'm like, yep. And we could go here. So I'm super pumped we're having this conversation.
We might end up with a part 3. And we were both just talking. I was like, oh shit, we're having a podcast episode today. I didn't wash my hair. But I said, who cares? You guys want the content. You're not here for my looks. So I'm sure I'll get some YouTube hater for that. So anyway, Kyira, I have a strong definition in my mind about what trauma really is. But I just want to open it up. What do you think trauma is? How do you define trauma?
So I think being a very visual person, I always process things through some sort of visual metaphor. So what I think about is sort of a ball rolling on its natural course of progression. And so we're not suggesting everybody's on the same path or that everybody's ball's rolling in the same way, but whatever that natural developmental path is for an individual, I think about trauma as essentially being anything that knocks you off that path and forces your brain to create some sort of an adaptive response to move in a new path or to try to get back on that path in some way. And so there's for many people, and this is probably what we'll get into, it feels like a minor repair. It's not that big. I didn't lose my home in a hurricane. I wasn't raped. I wasn't sexually abused by a member of my family member. These really kind of big ticket things that we've been told, well, this is trauma here. And so it's oftentimes these minor things that happen, and minor, I say purely just in the sense of what we use as sort of this objective, in air quotes here, scale to measure it, but something that was big enough for that ball of development to move off course, and it forced your brain to have to adapt, and then you kind of move on. And the more that happens, the more you are forced off your path, the more you have to adapt, the more you're kind of finding yourself unable to get back onto that path. I think about the effect it has on your sense of self, the way that you function, the way that you show up in the world, and how without being aware of that and those changes and that it's not what other people experience or sort of the norm, how different that can make you feel, how disconnected from the world it can make you feel. And you start to feel like, What's wrong with me? Why can't I do these things other people can? Why is this so hard for me? Am I not normal? So that's really, I think, how I conceptualize it. And then my goal is to keep it big enough that there are so many questions that a client or an individual has that we start to open a dialogue where essentially we see everything can kind of fit in there, not just here's my list of 5 things. And if you don't have this, then you probably don't have trauma.
Okay, so let's back it up. I have so many ways to dissect this. First of all, I don't disagree. I have a little sign behind me here, and that's my definition of trauma. And it says something to the fact of trauma is never the event.
Mm-hmm.
Trauma is the interpretation that we make from the experience, and it's how it shifts the way that we see ourselves, others, and the world around us, right? And you're talking about how it changes something in the mind. And what people don't understand is that there's a deep mind-body connection. And so much of the quote unquote trauma, if trauma is not the event, but the aftermath, if you will, the trauma can be the fact that your vagus nerve is hijacked, which we'll talk about, because your mind has shifted a little bit, right? So we're somatically experiencing a lot of shifts in our body, whether it's a diagnosis of something or not. It also changes how we deal with things cognitively, right? So if our amygdala is on, our frontal temporal complex or cortex is offline, which we'll talk about. But before we dive into that, I want something to be clear to the listeners, which there are lots of types of trauma, right? Like you can have a physical trauma because you were in an accident or a war scene or had a traumatic fall. Like my dad had a traumatic fall, shattered his leg, and they literally sent him to a hospital called shock trauma.
Oh, geez.
And it's a hospital that only deals with really traumatic injuries to the body. So you can have a physical trauma, which also can have, and it can have an emotional component, right? Because we feel helpless, powerless, out of control, what have you. There's childhood trauma and there's developmental trauma, which they sound like they're the same things, but they're actually a little different. Childhood trauma could be defined as a singular incident that you experienced in childhood or a series of individual but not related experiences that were each individually traumatic. But it was almost kind of like a one-off. Versus developmental trauma, which tends to be my sweet spot, which is you have this mesh of experiences, like adverse experiences over and over and over again that are happening over a long period of time. And how impactful it is the intensity, the duration, the frequency in your developmental years. So from 0 to adolescence, right? From infancy until maybe 14, 15, 16 ish. And the lens that it changes for you to look through and how you relate to the world in maybe a way that's relevant then, but no longer relevant, 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And then there are a handful of other kind of definitions of trauma. So for the period of what we're talking about, I think it's fair to say we're going to be mostly in that developmental trauma space.
Yeah, I think that's really, like, even as you're talking and I go back to my visual of the ball, what I imagine is, again, sort of the ball being kicked off, and it is like that response, how the body, how the brain is trying to get the ball back in its path. And if you imagine as it's working so hard to heal, to move through, and it's almost there, and then something else happens and now it's kicked off again. And so you almost imagine it's like branches of a tree getting farther and further out from the trunk over time. So as you're describing it, I think that I'm seeing my visual even more solidified in my brain of that is what it is. And then it is this way that then we come back, I think a lot of times later on, and we put individual events in a microscope, and then we say, but that doesn't seem that bad. So that's not that traumatic. But we're taking the context of the compounding nature and the effect of what happens. Exactly. So as you're saying that, I think that's where a lot of people unintentionally and probably from their own shame, their own stories, they dismiss their experiences as being traumatic because they're going back to that. Well, this one isolated incident isn't in and of itself traumatic.
Right.
And it's still trying to make something that really is subjective, objective when we do that. And there isn't a way to fully make trauma a defined objective experience.
No. And I think, I think it's good for us to talk about it because you tapped into it, this idea, and I'll just use these two terms because they get used a lot, this big T and little t trauma, right? So sometimes when I do workshops on what is trauma, I use weather patterns as like a visualization. So if somebody hears about Katrina or somebody hears about a massive hurricane or tsunami or tornado, they think trauma. They think that's going to have a really severe negative impact on the people in its wake, right? And they might even say that's going to be traumatic for that community.
Mm-hmm.
But what about my cousin in Dallas, my family in Dallas, who this summer had literally 90 days of 3-digit heat?
Mm-hmm.
Or what about the people who live, say, in Portland, Oregon, where it just rarely is ever sunny and it's always just kind of damp and rainy and there's just this consistency of mist in the air? Is it not to say that these more covert experiences that are more like this extended long period of dysfunction in the weather, whether it's heat or moisture, can be somewhat very profound and impactful. And it can change the way that you navigate the world. So if trauma is not the event and trauma is anything that at a long consistency can leave you feeling unimportant, unseen, unheard, insignificant, unsafe, also leads you to believe I'm not worthy of being seen, heard, safe, significant, important. I'm not deserving of it, ... I'm not enough. That's the trauma, because the moment you start, I'm going to pull my little brain down. The moment you start telling yourself you're not enough, that amygdala part of your brain is going to go on. The frontal cortex is going to go offline. Your vagus nerve is going to start to whack out, right? It's going to start to get hijacked. And now your whole body is in this dysregulated state. If your body and your mind didn't get into a dysregulated state, you'd never have a message being given to you that you're uncomfortable with.
Well, I mean, as you were talking, what's interesting, so burnout, even though it's not a diagnosis, is a syndrome that is the result of high acute experiences or high acuity experiences or prolonged exposure to these experiences. So what I think is really interesting is I think burnout kind of became like a sexy term. So people are all the time. I mean, when I lead workshops on burnout, the number of people that turn out for them, it's astronomical. Same exact, honestly, same presentation, but I just titled it something with trauma, way less people would come. But the
100%.
issue is if they're burnt out, they can just do something about it. They can try a little bit harder. They can fix the behaviors. They just got to take a little bit break and everything will be fine. But if I say, wait a minute, this is not, yes, I think all of us, there's a collective experience of burnout after going through COVID. Do I think it's burnout though? No. Do I think it's prolonged exposure to traumatic experiences and losses and unresolved grief? Yes. So it's easy, I think, for us to name it as burnout. And I think that's the more socially acceptable term. So a lot of people hearing this are able to relate to that, have probably in the last week said at some point in time, I'm burnt out or I'm overwhelmed. Those two things are signals that we need to go deeper. And typically the question is this the first time you've been here? Or have you really ultimately been here, for years?
I'm laughing because two things. Just finished writing this book. Okay. This ebook to coordinate with a class that I just created. That's a workshop I give all the time. And the reason why I developed this workshop, so for people that are listening to the podcast and not watching the video, the name of the ebook is Unmasking Burnout, uncovering the causes of burnout that you may not have considered and shining a light on the hidden culprits that contribute to your depletion.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I created that workout and subsequently this book was because I was asked, you're going to laugh, to give a workshop on trauma, but don't call it about trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, okay. So when I'm working with my clients, what am I seeing them experience? What's the language they use?
Mm-hmm.
They're burnt out, they're burnt out, they're burnt out. So I spent a lot of time researching and developing this workshop that kind of shows them this cross section of developmental trauma and burnout, because there are a handful of things we learn as coping strategies to deal with this change in our environment, right? So if you're using that ball analogy that you talked about, what are the things we figure out to keep that on track?
Right.
Do we fight? Do we flee? Do we fawn? Do we freeze?
Well,
right?
Or the ball's off track, but you're wanting everybody to think it's on. So what are the ways that you're mask that
right.
too? Right.
So we're people pleasing, we're deprioritizing ourselves, we're, not setting boundaries necessarily. And those are all can be signs of unresolved trauma. They're consequences of. It's the aftermath, but it's what's leading to the burnout. And you can see it at work. You can see it in caretaking. You can see it in every facet of life. And that is when I am asked to give a talk and I give a series of different topics to talk on, that's the one that is selected the most because it's universal.
Well, and it's safer because they think everybody will get on that, and then you're going to give people the tools to just fix it. So then they're better. And a lot of, I think, unfortunately, corporate wellness work is around that. I need you to get people moving again. I need you to come in and tell them what's going on and how they need to fix it, which also is about putting the responsibility on the individual, not on the collective culture, to change the way that we're recapitulating some of those patterns and keeping people stuck in a feeling like they have to perform and mask to be able to be okay.
But what I always find so funny so I'm right outside of New York City. So I have a lot of friends, a lot of family members, a lot of peers that work in Manhattan, or maybe the business has left Manhattan, but it has this Manhattan-like culture, right? Of go, 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 go. And what I find so interesting about that is these companies prey on people not knowingly, I'm assuming, who have a lot of well-developed coping strategies from how they learned how to navigate these experiences growing up. And then they further traumatize them by putting them into these environments that are unwavering and shaming. And then they start to burn out. And I literally just had a friend of mine, I hadn't seen her for a few years because of COVID. And I saw her over Memorial Day weekend. And this is someone who lived in a suburb of New York City, did the New York City commute as a working mom, was working 60, 70 hours a week, as many do in this area. And nothing was ever enough because that's always the culture. And she was burning out and burnt out. And so when her boss came to her and said, let's talk about your goals for the following year, she said, respectfully, I think I'm going to quit because I'm not okay. And do you know what this gal said to her? Oh, don't quit. We have burnout leave. And you can take burnout leave for 6 months and get full pay. Now, this is a huge, big company in New York.
Wow.
Okay. It's a global organization. And I was like, what the fuck? I was like, you'd rather pay someone not to work and take, I'm going to put in quotes, burnout leave than either change your culture that is like the antithesis of burnout or provide some sort of resource up front It's this reaction versus this proactivity that they could be taking to make sure people feel supported, seen, heard, significant, and important in the workplace. You'd rather beat the shit out of them until they finally say mercy, which how many people are going to say mercy?
Right.
Because they're going to have more shame. So it's a hedge. And yet they're willing to pay you. So then she's, after the 6 months, she still was doing a lot of healing. She really used that 6 months to start to heal. And she wasn't ready to go back. And they said, you can take extended leave. We just won't pay you, but you still have your job. You can take a full year of burnout. And I just thought that is crazy.
But I think it's a testament to the underlying belief is that it's this person's problem to fix so that they can come back and be in line. And I don't think it's a conscious awareness. So even, I'm sure you've read this book. I don't know if you've ever talked about it on your podcast before, but All About Love by Bell Hooks, where she talks about, forget what chapter it's in, but basically the idea of normalized dysfunction and how we confuse love with abuse. But when you've grown up in that, it's essentially like a brainwashing. So you don't even recognize that that's not okay. So when we think about systems, like my husband is an emergency medicine physician, there have been a lot of changes in residency trainings and programs to protect physicians in their training so that they can't be working 72, 96 hours straight without sleep, that their training hours, there has to be some circadian rhythm association, especially within residency trainings, because we see high rates of suicide in the emergency medicine field specifically. It's really, really high. There's a lot of depression, a lot of, performance anxiety, things like that. But then the expectation is basically don't sleep and then go in and perform your job. But one of the things that happens is whenever these changes are put at the systems level, there's a bucking back from the culture, the deep-seated people that have gone through this. Well, we all did it. We toughened through it. And so there's also this kind of, well, this is what was my norm, so the norm shouldn't change. And there's a lot of unpacking. And usually it's a defensive, almost aggressive response when people say that. But so it's easier if it's, well, that kid just couldn't hack it. That woman she doesn't have it. She needs to go fix it and then come back. It also, when you think about it, is way cheaper. That is way cheaper than stopping. Yeah. But you're not, if they were to shut down their entire operation and redo anything, then the entire company would need to take 6 to 12 months of burnout leave.
Right.
And who's going to do that?
Right. I mean, look, she'd been with this company for 20 years. She didn't even know it existed. It was like this covert, like, oh shit, I might lose her. So let me pull out the burnout leave card. But while you were talking, this conversation is going to go in so many beautiful ways, Kyira. As you were talking about your husband and this change, and then you get this buck back of, well, what the hell? Like, I did it, so therefore you should suffer too.
Right.
The first thing that came to my mind is, and there's generational trauma 101.
Yep.
I mean, when you talk about generational trauma and you talk about intergenerational trauma, and you have people that you're working with, people that I'm working with, that talk about the experiences that they had, often at the hands of their caretaker or their parents. And remember, this does not, when I say at the hands, it does not mean you were abused or had violence or aggression. It could be that your parent was completely disconnected and not present. It could be that your parent was immature and that you had to be the parent. It can show up in so many different ways, right? This does not have to be these big T kind of situations, but how often do we hear, oh, our kids are lazy, our kids are, don't have grit, our kids aren't this, that, the other thing, because they put up with ABCXYZ. Therefore, you should put up with ABCXYZ, or my parents weren't available, so suck it up. It happened for me, can happen for you.
Right.
And then you have this group of people who unknowingly in solidarity, though completely in isolation, are this community of cycle breakers who are saying, you know what? I hear it worked for you, but that's fucked up. And that's this kind of myth of normal, right? Whether it's Bell Hooks or Gabor Mate, who has this book of normal, or the myth of normal, which is maybe the way you had it actually wasn't great either, but you just
Right.
didn't get it because that was your norm. But I see different now and I want different and I believe it's available to me. So therefore it stops with me.
Right. But also think about that individual. I think about the older gentleman that responded with such a frustration when we were having this conversation about residency protection and some of these things. And part of it is, again, it's more than just what they did in their residency program and what they did in there. And think about any major company, any place where you're really trying to grow in the expectation. A lot of it then is that person has probably spent so many decades feeling that lack of any sort of validation and empathy, and their walls and their cages have been rusted over in anger and resentment and loneliness. And so that's the other hard part is, especially when we're asking people to come into a workplace and set boundaries, how are they supposed to do that when the language is there? I mean, it's hard for us to help people with that, and we're trained to do that. And so it's this sort of cultural kind of lack of awareness how to even have these conversations, to even say that you never should have gone through that either. That wasn't okay for you. And I'm really sorry that the system was set up in a way that you couldn't push back in any meaningful way. You didn't have a voice and you should have. Right. And I need you to recognize that this is about more than you versus me. This is about changing the culture. This is about changing the system, whatever those conversations are. But we need that. And that also then puts that person in a position to try to help somebody else heal when they're probably burnt out and overwhelmed too. So you see the ripple effect and how at the end, that's why it's easier to be like, you know what, fuck it. Let's just put a 6-month policy in. When we need it, we need it. Because this just
pull
feels
out the
easier.
Card when you have to pull out the card.
Exactly. Because that's easier than trying to figure out how we do this. Because I don't know how to do that.
And listen, you have to be introspective.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I, have these channels like YouTube, Instagram, what have you on social media. You have these channels because I think you and I are both really passionate outside of our private practice to create these kind of awakening aha moments for just the general public of like, wait a minute, I get that. That makes sense to me. And wait, so that could be trauma. It doesn't really matter what we call it. Trauma is a wound, right? It's a scab. It's something that hasn't been fully healed yet. It doesn't have to be called trauma. The benefit of putting a label on it is once you understand what it is, then you gain some agency on different ways that you can heal that wound. Right? So if trauma doesn't speak to you and every time we say that word, you get this visceral, like negative response, just think of it as, like you said, that ball rolling down, and every single time you think you're going to get it back on track, something else happens. And it's this layering of frustration and lack of safety or whatever it was, this layering of adverse experiences and events that left you feeling in a way that is not productive, and finding out, oh gosh, in general terms, that's developmental trauma or childhood trauma. And what can I do to learn more about that? What's available for me there? Right? Because unfortunately, and I'd love, as we round this out, this is something I knew I wanted to talk to you about, and I wasn't sure how I was going to bring it in. You're a licensed practitioner in the mental health. I'm not licensed. I'm a trauma coach. I'm always very, very clear on that. They're very different trainings and what have you. But I know as a person that was in therapy for 25 years, I never heard the term trauma. And B, I don't think that at least then, so we're going to say 1983 to 2013, let's call it, that there was really little to none trauma-informed training within the curriculum for psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, mental health practitioners. This is not an inherent part. And when I say that to people, they actually think I'm crazy. But am I inaccurate in that statement?
No, and I think that there's a misconception, and so there's the problem is bigger in the sense that we're all existing, needing support, but not exactly sure what type of support there is. And we're sort of fed this idea that therapy is a predominant way to support. I think therapy is great.
I do too.
Many times, not all the time. I also think there's a lot of people that are practicing that aren't ideal. And that's the case in anything, whether it's a coach, a therapist, a physician, whatever. But one of the things that I think there's not a full awareness of, like my friend who's an orthopedic surgeon, he's going to be really, really good at hand stuff. Like that's what he specializes in. He can do emergency surgery on somebody's hand. When you're talking about somebody coming in with some very severe, like full body, I don't even know, I'm trying to think of an example right now. Jordan, my husband, might be able to do that because he's trained in those things, but he's not going to be able to perform hand surgery. That's not what he's trained in. So there's this misconception that for therapists, for helpers, even for coaching, that, well, they're this, so they can help me here. So in my training, I was in I think I graduated in 2017. You had to take a full-on trauma course and pass certain levels, but even that, it's one semester. So when you think about that, that's not enough to fully immerse yourself in these things. There's now continuing education requirements. We are required to have a certain number of trainings that are around trauma. But continuing education means nothing if the person's not invested in it. It's really easy to pass through and just fill out some answers to some quizzes and get your credit. So I think the big thing that I think about is, we know research has shown us that the connection with the person that's supporting us is the most important thing. So that doesn't necessarily mean therapy or coach is better. It's, am I connected with this person? And then second is this person equipped with the skills and tools to help me in the ways that I need it? And I don't think for many people, they know those questions to ask. So I've been practicing, I specialize in eating disorders, and I've been practicing and working in eating disorder clinics, fields up in hospitalization levels for 6 years now. I guess a year plus, because I also did my internship there. So 7 years. I only just got enough hours of work with direct clients to be called an eating disorder specialized therapist. So that takes that many years to even have enough language to work around those things. So with trauma, I think it's just another layer. We don't have enough. There's not enough built in inherently in our training. So what you have to look for is someone that's passionate enough about it, that's where they center their work. And then even specifically, you've mentioned intergenerational trauma. If we think about things like systemic oppression, racism, intergenerational trauma around there are people that is their specialty, is specifically talking about racism in the US, systems of oppression, intergenerational transmission of trauma. So you can get very granular. But I wouldn't be the best person to do that. I am trauma informed, taken tons of trainings. But if someone just saw trauma on my website and I took their insurance, they might come see me and I'm not going to be the right fit. And when they've waited for months to come in to see me and then I'm not the right fit, many people will stay anyways and tolerate mediocre care because they're afraid to start the process over again and see no one.
It's so arduous. Yeah. And I agree with that. I've a couple of things. One, I know my zone of genius and my area of passion, and where I put most of my effort is developmental trauma.
Right.
Period. End of story. And very specifically, helping people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s gain a deeper understanding and awareness that the experiences that they had could be lumped into this idea of developmental trauma. And by the way, how does that affect you long term? Right. And is this why we're having all of these challenges? And if so, because trauma is never the event, it's the interpretation. How do we change that interpretation? Right? That's the work. And that's why I specialize in hypnosis and a couple of other tools, because it's a really great way to get under the hood pretty quickly, which is so beneficial to them. I loved your question, and this is where I want to round out this episode. Maybe we'll meet again. Is, if you're working with a therapist, or you're working with a psychiatrist, or you're working with some sort of mental health practitioner, and you're curious now because of this conversation as to whether or not they're trauma trained or trauma informed, because they're two different things. One's just a higher level of the other. Ask first ask, what's your experience of training with trauma? What's your understanding of trauma? Could this part of what I'm challenged with be developmental trauma? But you can also ask them to give you an intake or some sort of rating scale to help you determine that. And one of the ones that you can ask, and we were talking about this earlier, and maybe this is where we take the next episode, is the ACEs intake. And the ACEs study that is so prevalent, and I use the ACEs study in my intake with my clients. It gives me a very good snapshot before I even meet with them, because they fill this out online when they book their session with me. It gives me real insight. If there's a list of 10 to 15 questions and I ask, why are you coming? And they say, I'm stuck. I have anxiety. Sometimes it's depression. I don't know how to have a healthy relationship, whatever it is. And yet, let's just say my rating scale is 15 and they filled out 8, or they filled out all 15, or they filled out 0, whatever it is. Up to that point, they have no idea that there's a connection to those experiences and how they've been feeling and why they're coming to see me.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll say things to me like, how did you even know to ask that question? Or nobody's ever asked me those questions. I've been in therapy for 20 years. Nobody's asked me those questions. That's a big light bulb. So that's, as we round this out, that is one thing that you can do if you're working with a therapist. I'm speaking to, the listener. If you're working with a therapist or somebody in the mental health space, if you've been struggling, if things are just, the dial's not moving to where you think it should be moving, maybe developmental trauma is a part of the challenge that hasn't been unearthed yet. And ask them what their familiarity is, either with trauma and or ACEs. ACEs is an acronym. It's ACES, and it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences.
I love that. And I'll send it to you so you can maybe include it in the show notes. I made a handout for people on how to find the right therapist, and you can use it to find the right coach, support, all of that. But questions and things that I don't think people really know, I put allowed in quotes because I think a lot of it is this like self-permission to advocate for what we need. And a lot of it is not even necessarily knowing what we need. So how do we know what to ask? So I can send that to you too, so we can share that. Because I think there's a lot of things, even if that person specializes in trauma and you're like, okay, they check the boxes on this problem point here, they might not be a good fit energetically. There might be certain things, I don't do well working with a woman that I would identify as kind of being in the same age range as my mom. It's very triggering for me. I need to work with somebody that's either younger or a male. That's how I can be pushed and be moved through. So somebody that I see more as like a peer, or somebody that is male at any age. So there's some other things too to think about. And I think it's the layering again, depending on what our experiences are. There are some people that are going to listen to you and me and be like, okay, maybe what you're saying is great, but I don't connect with either one of you. Or, they connect with you or not with me, or vice versa. And so I think really just being open to the fact that there is a multitude of people out there that can support you. It's not just one person. Now go find them in a sea. There's lots of them. It's you first giving yourself permission, feeling like you are allowed to decide who that person needs to be, what they need to share in terms of identities and different aspects, and then also layering in that piece that you just said. So I'll make sure that that's there for people that they can download and use to kind of help with that as well.
I love that. And I'm thinking if you're open to another, powwow on this, maybe what I'll do is I'll hop on to Instagram and actually ask people what kind of questions they have.
Oh, that's great.
Use social media to crowdsource. Like if we were to go back out again, what do you want to know, but you've been afraid to ask?
Yeah.
Right. I think that could be really good, because really the motivation behind this series within the podcast is just to educate and give you agency in your own healing.
Yeah, absolutely. And to know too that for many of us, one thing, and this will just maybe be a cliffhanger for people as they think about what might be possible, So for me, I've moved over. A lot of the work now that I do in shame resiliency is on the coaching side. So I see people on coaching side. I also still am a licensed therapist, so I can work on both sides of things. But one of the things that I've always done as a coach, and I brought it into my therapy practice, was I do 20-minute free consultations with people. And I do that up front, whether I've got a wait list or not, so that you're not waiting to potentially work with me just because I'm an eating disorder therapist or a trauma therapist that has an opening. And then we meet and it's not the right fit. So we take that time right up front, and those are free. We don't bill your insurance. We don't do anything with that. It's just a small conversation, and it doesn't happen in a lot of large centers. So some people that are based on their insurance or needs using community agencies, they might not be able to get that in the same way. But there are tips and tricks for how to ask the intake specialist when you are calling in to make an appointment, or in these private practice settings, saying, hey, I would like to do they offer any free consults? I would love to just make sure that we're the right fit before taking up a spot in their schedule. And oftentimes that will open the door for that. And you can have that 15 or 20-minute conversation to get that feeling, even if it's over the phone, of just, does this feel right to me? Does this feel okay? Do I feel like this would be a good fit and somebody I'd be willing to work on building the safety and the connection to be open with, to do the healing that I maybe don't want to do, but I know that I need to do, and I want to get to the point where I want to do it as well.
Yeah. Perfect cliffhanger, because you just gave me 5 more things I feel like we could talk about. So this has been great. I've feel so blessed. I don't even know how I found you. I think I saw you on YouTube once, or maybe it was on Instagram. I don't know.
It was meant to be.
I was like, this girl has her shit together. This is the kind of person I wish I could sit down over a cup of coffee with and just jam out. And I literally reached out and was like, do you want to jam out on the podcast? So I think this has been great. I'm really excited for episode number 3. Again, this is episode number 2 in a series with Kyira Wackett. The first one, the link is in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, I strongly encourage you to follow the podcast, subscribe to Kyira's YouTube channel. I'll put that in the show notes. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel. This is our way of, again, talking about free and no cost resources, giving you the opportunity to take some agency over your healing. Again, my name is Stacey Uhrig. I'm your host, and thank you so much for joining us today.